You are standing on a corner in the East Village on a Tuesday morning in 1981, and you are nobody, not in the way that means you are invisible, but in the way that means you have not yet been chosen. And in this world, those are very different things. Your father worked the docks. His father worked a bakery on Mulberry Street. You grew up understanding, without anyone ever explaining it directly, that certain men in your neighborhood operated by a different set of rules. Rules that were older and more reliable than anything written in a courthouse downtown. You are 23 years old. You are smart, in the way that streets make people smart. And you have just been told, not asked, told, that a man named Rizzoli wants to speak with you about a small matter that requires someone he can trust. You do not know yet what that sentence costs, but you are about to find out. The associate, you are not a member of anything yet, and that is the most important thing. To understand, as you sit across from Rizzoli in the back booth of a restaurant on Sullivan Street, where the espresso is strong and the conversations never get repeated. Your title, if you can call it that, is associate, a word that sounds clean and professional but means something very specific in this context. You are useful, you are being evaluated, and you have not yet earned the right to be trusted with anything that truly matters. Your first responsibility is simple on the surface and complicated underneath. You collect a list of names, a list of amounts, a schedule, and an expectation that the numbers will match when you come back. Nothing is written down. Everything is remembered. This is your first real lesson in how this world functions. Paper creates evidence, and evidence creates problems. So paper does not exist here in any form that could hurt anyone. What you learn at this level goes far beyond the mechanics of debt collection. Because debt here is not really about money. It is about hierarchy made tangible, about the daily reinforcement of who has power and who operates. Under it, every man who hands you an envelope does so with a specific expression, somewhere between resignation and relief, and you begin to understand that expression intimately, because it is the same expression you wear every time you report back to Rizzoli. You are inside a chain that extends in both directions further than you can see, and your position on that chain is clear. You are near the bottom. You are being watched, and the watching never stops. What you gain at this level is access, not to power, not yet, but to proximity, which is its own form of currency in a world where proximity determines everything. You gain a small weekly income that feels larger than it is because it arrives reliably, without taxes, without a boss in the conventional sense, and with the quiet implication that more is coming if you perform. You gain a reputation in a very small circle as someone who is steady, someone who does not panic, someone who shows up on time and does not ask questions that have not been invited. In a world that runs entirely on reputation, this is not a small thing. What you lose, though you do not recognize the loss yet because it happens gradually and without announcement, is the possibility of a different kind of life. And you lose it not because someone takes it from you, but because every day you spend in this world makes the other world slightly less accessible, slightly more foreign, slightly more like a country whose language you are beginning to forget. You also lose the luxury of neutral associations because the people in your life now carry weight whether they know it or not, and your proximity to them becomes a liability they have not consented to. The risk at this level is acute and specific. You can be arrested for actions you take on behalf of people who will not acknowledge your relationship with them if you are caught, and you have no protection, no lawyer on retainer, no union, no structure that intervenes on your behalf. You are exposed at the bottom of a hierarchy that insulates itself upward and sacrifices downward, and this is not a secret. It is understood by everyone who has ever occupied this position, including you, and the fact that you accept it anyway is itself a form of the first test. To move up from here, you need to demonstrate one thing above all others: that you are not a problem, not that you are aggressive, not that you are ambitious, not that you are clever. Those things matter later. Right now, you must be someone who generates no friction, who absorbs pressure without transmitting it, who can look at a situation that would make most people nervous and simply continue functioning as if the nervousness does not exist inside you. The earner. 18 months pass, and the change in your status arrives not with ceremony, but with a different kind of conversation. Rizzoli introduces you to a man named Falcone, and the way he says your name when he makes the introduction carries something it did not carry before, a slight elevation, as if your name now occupies a higher shelf. Falcone runs a crew that operates across 3 boroughs, and your new responsibility is to manage a small portfolio of what the outside world would call illegal gambling operations, but what you understand to be something closer to a neighborhood. Financial institution, numbers, sports lines, a card game on Thursday nights. In the basement on 116th Street, where the stakes are real and the hospitality is genuine. You are now an earner, which means the organization expects money from you regularly, and the amount expected will grow as your capacity grows, and the growth is not optional. Your responsibilities at this level multiply in ways that require a different kind of intelligence than what got you here. You are now managing people as well as operations, runners, bookies, a small number of men who work under your direction without technically being told. They work under your direction because nothing here is direct and everything is layered. You learn to communicate in a language built almost entirely of implication, where a raised eyebrow carries more information than a paragraph, where the absence of a response to a request is itself a response that carries specific meaning, and where the speed at which someone returns your call tells you almost everything you need to know about where you stand with them on any given day. What you learn at this level is the internal economy of the organization. How money moves, where it comes from, how it gets cleaned, how it gets divided, how the percentages work, and most importantly, who gets paid before anyone else gets paid. The organization taxes you. A percentage of everything you earn flows upward through a structure you are beginning to see more clearly, and the percentage is not negotiable. And it is paid first, before your own expenses, before your crew's wages, before anything. This is not a hardship, it is a clarification. You are not running a business. You are operating within someone else's business, and the rent is permanent and non-negotiable. And understanding this fully and accepting it fully is what separates the men who survive at this level from the men who develop resentments that eventually become problems. What you gain is real money now, not the modest income of an associate, but something that changes how you live in ways that are visible to people around you. A better apartment, a car that does not require explanation, the ability to take care of people in your family without having to explain the source, because the source is understood in your neighborhood, even when it is never named. You gain status that functions differently from money. It functions like gravity, pulling certain kinds of opportunities and certain kinds of people toward you without you having to reach. Men ask for your opinion on things. Men wait for you to sit before they sit. These are small signals, but in a world that communicates almost entirely through small signals, they are not small at all. What you lose at this level is more serious than what you lost before. You lose the clean boundary between your professional life and your personal life, because the two have now fused in ways that cannot be reversed. Your girlfriend, or your wife if you have made that decision now, lives inside this world whether she signed up for it or not. Your phone calls are potentially surveilled. The men you eat dinner with are known to federal investigators who have files with photographs. You are not a peripheral figure anymore. You are a node in a network that agencies have been mapping for decades, and your node has now been given a name in a file somewhere in a federal building in Lower Manhattan, and the file will only grow. The risk is no longer just arrest. It is the beginning of something more complex, because at this level you start to understand that the threats to your survival come from multiple directions simultaneously. From law enforcement, which is expected and manageable, and from inside the organization itself, which is less expected and significantly more dangerous, because organizational violence is swift and arrives without the procedural protections that law enforcement, at least theoretically, provides. A man who earns well and keeps his mouth shut and pays his percentages and does not develop enemies inside the structure will survive this level for years. A man who cuts corners, who holds back on his percentages, who develops a reputation for being clever in the wrong direction, that man's problems begin here and end somewhere much worse. To advance beyond this, you need to bring something to Falcone's attention that demonstrates you are capable of thinking about the organization's interests rather than just your own. A new revenue source, a connection that opens a door previously closed, a problem solved in a way that saves someone above you from having to solve it themselves. You need to be promoted from useful to necessary, and the difference between those two things is the entire distance between where you are and where you want. The ceremony is private, and the words are ancient, and the weight of what you are promising is not metaphorical. You are now a made man, a soldier in the Genovese family, which means you have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed, and the crossing is permanent in both directions, because the same organization that now fully protects you will also fully destroy you if you violate what you have just sworn. You are holding a burning card. Your trigger finger is bleeding slightly from a small cut that is part of the ritual, and the men in the room with you have faces that are absolutely still. And the stillness is not indifference. It is the expression of men who have been in this room before and understand exactly what this moment means in a way that you are only beginning to understand. Your responsibilities now expand into territory that is qualitatively different from what came before, because you are now responsible not just for earning but for maintaining order, which in the language of this organization means you are sometimes called upon to resolve disputes between men who operate below you, to communicate decisions made above you to people who need to hear them, and occasionally to do things that leave no documentary evidence and that you will never discuss in any context for the rest of your life. You learn that the organization's greatest discipline is silence, and that silence is not merely the absence of speech, but an active, cultivated practice that requires constant vigilance, because silence can be broken by something as ordinary as a drunk conversation at a wedding, a moment of pride that causes you to say something you should not have said, or the slow erosion of judgment that comes from years of operating under pressure. What you learn at this level is the full architecture of how the Genovese family maintains power. And the answer is not primarily through violence, though violence exists and is used with precision. The answer is through relationships with legitimate structures, unions, construction companies, politicians, police precincts, sanitation departments, and the dozens of industries in New York City where contracts are awarded by men who have learned over decades that certain contracts go certain ways, and that the peace this arrangement creates is worth the premium it costs. You are now inside the machine that maintains these relationships, not at the level where the relationships are managed, that is higher, but at the level where the maintenance work is done, where envelopes are delivered, where messages are conveyed, where the daily friction of keeping large numbers of people in agreement is reduced to something manageable. What you gain is a form of security that feels almost paradoxical given the obvious dangers of your position. No one touches a made man without permission, and permission for something like that requires authorization from the top of the structure, which means that ordinary civilian conflict, the kind that fills courtrooms and emergency rooms, simply does not apply to you in the same way. It applies to other men. This is not a small thing psychologically. You move through the city with a kind of quiet confidence that is visible to people who know what to look for, and the people who know what to look for, which includes virtually everyone in your world, respond to it in ways that smooth your passage through daily life in dozens of small, cumulative ways. What you lose is the last of your exits, because the oath you took is not a metaphor, and the organization's memory is longer than yours. Men who have tried to walk away from this life, not betray, simply walk away, have found that walking away is not a decision available to them, and the reasons are practical rather than merely philosophical. You know too much. You are connected to too many things, and your departure would create too many uncertainties that the organization cannot afford to leave unresolved. You understand this now not as a threat, but as a fact of your existence, the way a surgeon understands that their hands carry both healing and liability. The capability cannot be returned once it has been developed. The risk at this level introduces a dimension that was not present before. Federal conspiracy charges under the RICO statute, which means that your membership in the organization is itself a criminal act, independent of any specific crime you have committed, and that prosecutors can use your relationships, your associations, and your organizational position as evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise without having to prove you personally committed every act they allege. You begin to study this law the way a soldier studies terrain, not because you are planning to use it, but because understanding it is survival. De nível 4, de Capo. You have been running your own crew for 3 years now, and the distance between who you were on that corner in the East Village and who you are today is so vast that you sometimes experience it as a kind of vertigo, sensation that the man who started this journey and the man who now occupies this position are connected by a thread so thin that it strains to hold the weight of everything that has happened between them. Your crew is 11 men, spread across 2 boroughs, operating a portfolio of revenue streams that generates enough money every month to fund a small municipal government. You answer to the underboss, and the underboss answers to the boss, and the boss answers to the administration, and the administration answers to a code of conduct older than most countries. Your responsibilities at this level are primarily managerial and strategic, which means the work is less physical than it was before, but more mentally consuming, in ways that compound rather than diminish with time. You are running operations that require coordination across multiple industries, managing men with different temperaments and different levels of reliability, navigating the perpetual political complexity of an organization where alliances shift and loyalties are tested routinely, and the line between an internal dispute and an internal crisis is crossed without announcement. You spend enormous amounts of time on problems that have no clean solution, only least bad options, and your ability to consistently choose the least bad option is what the administration evaluates you on. What you learn at this level is the most sophisticated truth about how the Genovese family has survived and prospered while other families have collapsed. Around it, invisibility is a strategy, not a limitation. Where the Gambinos courted press coverage, and the result was John Gotti on the front page of every newspaper in the country, and ultimately in a federal courtroom for the rest of his natural life. The Genovese family made a different calculation decades earlier and never deviated from it. No interviews, no celebrity, no conspicuous consumption that creates photographs. The men at the top of this organization are not household names. That is not an accident. That is the discipline that has kept them functional while their rivals were systematically dismantled by a federal government that found it much easier to prosecute men who made themselves visible. What you gain is a level of financial comfort that is genuinely substantial, but also And this matters more than the money in ways you did not expect. You gain a kind of clarity about what you are and what this life is. The illusions have been gone for years, and what remains is something harder and more honest. You are good at this. You have built something real within the constraints of the world you operate in, and the men who work for you respect you in ways that feel earned rather than coerced. This is not a justification. It is simply an observation about what power feels like when you have worked for it incrementally across many years. What you lose is privacy, not in the public sense because you maintain your invisibility carefully, but in the internal sense, the private mental space, where a person processes their own experience without reference to the organization's needs. Everything you think about now passes through a filter of organizational consequence. Every relationship, every expense, every word in every conversation exists within the context of your position and what it requires. You have not had a thought that was entirely your own in years. You are 44 years old, and you are sitting in a federal courtroom in the Southern District of New York, and the prosecutor is reading from transcripts of conversations recorded in a car you owned, in a restaurant you frequented, in an office where you believed the sweep had been thorough, and as you listen to your own voice describe things that should have remained undescribed, you begin to understand what has been building for years. Without your full comprehension, the operation against you was not reactive. It was architectural. It was constructed the way a building is constructed, from the foundation upward, with precision and patience. And a timeline measured not in months but in years. 7 years of surveillance, 42 confidential informants, some of whom you trusted with things you have never told your family, 3 separate grand juries, a RICO indictment with 28 counts that connects your actions, your crew's actions, and the actions of men above you in the chain, into a single, continuous criminal enterprise that the government has no difficulty demonstrating has operated uninterrupted for decades. The ARG, the absolute peak of what you built, lasted perhaps 4 years. From the moment you understood the full scope of what you controlled to, the moment you understood that the scope of what controlled you was larger. At the peak, you sat in rooms where decisions were made about industries, about city contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, about labor, negotiations that affected tens of thousands of workers who had no idea that the outcome was determined before the negotiation began. You sat in those rooms, and you spoke, and your words had consequences that rippled outward across the city in ways you could trace if you chose to. That was real. That power was real, and the realization that the power was also a cage, that each thing you controlled also controlled. You constrained you, required you to be a specific kind of person. In every moment of every day, that realization came too late to be useful. The informant who broke the case open was a man you had known for 11 years, a man you had helped when he had problems, a man whose children you knew by name, a man who sat at your table at Christmas dinner in 2001 and looked you in the eye and said the things that friends say to each other, and who had been recording those conversations and transmitting them to a handler in a federal office building 17 blocks away. This is the mathematics of your world's undoing, the same system of trust that makes the organization functional, the deep, personal, long-cultivated trust that substitutes for the formal contracts that you cannot sign is the same system that, when it is breached, provides the government with precisely the kind of intimate, detailed, contextually rich evidence that no external surveillance could ever replicate. You were not defeated by technology. You were defeated by a man who chose to save himself at your expense, and his decision was made possible by the same bonds you believed made you safe. Your attorney, a brilliant, exhausted man who has spent 30 years navigating this territory, tells you with the measured calm of someone who has delivered this kind of assessment many times that the Evidence is comprehensive that the government's case is the strongest. He has seen against anyone in your position in his career, and that the realistic options are two: a trial that will almost certainly result in conviction on the majority of counts, and a sentence that exceeds your natural life expectancy, or a cooperation agreement that might preserve some portion of your remaining years as something other than a prison cell. You sit with this for a long time. You think about the oath. You think about the burning card and the blood and the faces that were absolutely still. You think about the men above you in the chain who are not in this courtroom because the evidence trail ends before it reaches them, because the architecture of the organization was built specifically to ensure that the chain could be severed without reaching the top. You were the firewall. That was always your function. You do not cooperate. This is not heroism. It is a calculation. And the calculation includes the understanding that the life available to a cooperating witness is a kind of erasure that you find in the end, worse than what the alternative offers. You are sentenced to 22 years. You are 51 years old when the sentence is handed down, and the math is not complicated. The organization does not mourn you. Mourning implies an ending, and from the organization's perspective, your chapter concluded, and the next chapter began without interruption. Within 8 months of your sentencing, a new Capo had been installed in your position, a man in his mid-30s, who grew up watching men like you operate, who learned the lessons of your rise and drew conclusions about what caused your fall, who has already identified the informant vulnerabilities in his network and addressed them with the cold efficiency of someone who has studied the case against you the way a medical student studies a pathology. The revenue streams you built continue to generate. The union relationships continue to function. The city contracts continue to flow in the same directions. They flowed before your name appeared in a federal indictment. This is the final lesson, and it is the one that nobody teaches you. When the door opens and the invitation arrives, the organization is not made of men. The men are made by the organization, shaped by it, used by it, and ultimately discarded when they become liabilities, which every man eventually does. The structure exists independent of any individual who has ever served within it, has survived the deaths and imprisonments of hundreds of men across nearly a century, and will continue to adapt, to absorb its losses, to recruit from the same neighborhoods, to cultivate the same ambitions, in the same kind of young men, standing on the same kind of corners, generation after generation, because the conditions that created it have not changed, and the human needs it fulfills have not diminished. You entered a system. The system remains. The corner in the east village is still there, and somewhere on that corner, or one very much like it, there is a young man who is 23 years old, who is smart in the way that streets make people smart, and who has just been told, not asked, told, that someone wants to speak with him about a small matter that requires someone they can trust. And the door is opening. Again, exactly as it always has. You've seen how this system works, but this is only one structure. Next, we're going deeper into a system where the pressure is even higher and the fall is faster. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Leave a like if you want more high-level breakdowns like this. And activate notifications, because once you're inside, you won't